Welcome back, everyone, to Tarot Journeys with Guy. How's everybody doing today? So today what we're going to continue to do is our tarot lesson and the hidden history around the tarot. So what we're going to continue with is looking at the Magician card. So we started a few days ago with the Fool, okay, and kind of laid out a lot of the history and a lot of the things that are kind of encoded in that card. Now that was a lot of information, and it's quite a task to condense it all, okay? But it's sort of necessary in understanding a little bit what one of the layers of the cards are communicating. With the Magician card, it's kind of interesting. The Magician in readings represents communication on many levels, right? So now what I've got here is the same as last time. I laid out a couple of representations of the cards. We've got the Tarot of Marseille, kind of reminiscent of the early wood block pressings that we would have saw at that time period. And then cards that may have looked closer to what they were in the end of the 1800s. And then we've got two Rider-Waite cards. I use the original Rider-Waite usually. It's called the original Rider-Waite. And this one is a Rider-Waite, but this is the Radiant Tarot. Radiant Wise Tarot, okay? So today I'm gonna keep that card out because it's more colorful and it actually kind of illustrates a little bit better some of the symbols that we're going to look at. You see here, these are in French, la batture. Now again, I'm going to apologize for my French because it's terrible, but like the Magician, but in the old sense, this was the juggler, the card shark, the mountebank, the grifter, the guy on the street. This type of character. This was also like the actor, right? So it was kind of part of this traveling group of people before people even knew about the gypsies, right? This is where the sort of the minstrels and the court gestures and the troubadours would connect, and they would go off and they would give performances and things, right? These guys were considered on the bottom rung. They were the bottom of the bottom of the bottom. They were considered worse than trash, okay? So it's kind of interesting in the sense of how the esoteric story is unfolded and how, because part of it was transmitted through these guys. This is how some of this came about. And I mean, I talked about how the gypsies, the Romani, were gifted diviners, okay? And gifted with cartomancy and with the stars and foretelling the future. This harkened back, this kind of took us back to the ancient world of the Delphic oracles and the soothsayers of old. This was part of it. These guys would present this sort of front, but underneath of it, a lot of them were well studied and well learned, like the troubadours, okay? So right away when we look at the card, we've got this character, okay? So he's Rider, like A.E. Waite and Pamela Coleman Smith, who created the modern rendition of it. They've kind of changed this character and kind of given him more of legitimacy, okay, and spiritualized him, rather than in the cloak of the renegade, okay? So right away we've got this character, and he's giving us the sign of as above, so below, okay? But in his right hand, pointing upwards, he's holding the rod, okay? Now the Magician's wand in some ways, right? So if you see in his image here, he's got his wand in his left hand, okay? So this is a symbol of the different traditions that we see in the modern sense, especially in the mystery schools. Now, if people are acquainted with this notion that the idea that the right-hand path was the path of light, the path of creation, and the left-hand path was the path of destruction, was the path of the sorcerers, was the path of the black magicians. So he switched this around, indicating to us that this tradition with the tarot and what they're presenting comes from the right-hand path. Okay? The right-hand path, the ones that have brought this information to us are the ones that refuse to hold the secrets that had been held for many, many millennia. Okay. And like A.E. Waite, he's got this story of kind of going into both areas, let's say, like with the Order of the Golden Dawn, and realizing the nature of the left-hand path. Okay. And this is just a symbol that he's employed to sort of show us, and this idea of as above, so below in Hermetic philosophy, going back into ancient Egypt to Alexandria. This is an old philosophical take on how the unity of heaven and earth is achieved and is established. Okay. So, and in that sense of it, it kind of leads us to this idea that everything is sort of operating in a harmonic. And so when we recognize part of the divine plan in its micro sense, that can also be applied to the macro. And what we see in the large scale, in the cosmos, can also be applied to the individual, okay? All coming from a spiritual source. Now we know we've got this left-hand path people attempting to totally get control and have perverted that sort of notion where people have deemed that kind of idea even as evil, but yet this is a part of a continuation of the ancient religions and the truth of the ancient religions. Okay, so that's one thing, right? So he's kind of drawing out this sign of as above and so below. Okay, and it's a specific notion in the sense of what we can track in the heavens, what we can track in the night sky, what we can track with the zodiac and the planets and the sun, its course, and the moon, also applies to us in our path on the earth, and also part of our release when it comes time for us to leave. And if you look into sort of ancient Egyptian sort of understandings, that what we know now, and like the ancient and the Hermetica, that's a very big part of it. Now the alchemists, for good and for not good, but the not good alchemists and the ones that we see now, they have perverted that notion. Okay, so on the old image here, we've got the juggler, he's the magician, he's wearing his hat. Okay, so that hat in the old, how people interpret it, and you can actually see it does look like what's called an analemma. Now, an analemma is an old way of tracking the motion of the sun, and if you were to find a point and align it due south, due north and south, in the cardinal directions of east and west, but at noon each day, and mark that point as a shadow, right? If you take and mark a point, it would draw out this shape, which is a lopsided infinity symbol, okay, depending if you're in the northern or southern hemisphere. And so that's also what's above the head of the magician here. But in some ways, it kind of looks, it's hard to tell that it's an analemma. It's almost like it's an infinity symbol. So in a way, it can be taken as both as this continuation from antiquity, from the ancient world, up until our time. Okay, so that's another important thing. So right away we start to get this notion of a calendar and this system around astrology, as above, so below. The four objects on the table on one level represent those four cardinal points on the calendar. So that's one thing that he's presenting, and you got to realize these symbols and these allegories are meant to be expressed in levels, in layers, and there's different meanings, right? And there's more than one meaning, and often there's 7 meanings in the symbol that's being presented. when I was describing the cards, I kind of laid out that there's a major arcana and a minor arcana. Now, many people at home are acquainted with the cards. Okay, so they kind of understand this. Now, arcana means mystery in Latin. So the great mystery and the minor mystery. What we're talking about and what the magician represents in some ways is the lesser mystery. Part of the initiation of the cards, the ancient system of as above, so below, as within, so without, is very tied. This is a big part of it. You need to understand that to take the next steps with it. Okay. And so we're already started getting into this sort of understanding that part of the reason why the cards were developed back in the 1400s and a little bit before maybe when they was a way of replacing this ancient way of initiating people, because it was missing. It was already starting to become missing at that time. And so we start to kind of unravel a little bit more about how there is a hidden motive, a hidden history behind this. And it is coming from the right hand path. The other thing too, right? And so I'm going to pull out the Fool card again, just to show us another little sort of thing here that A. Waite has kind of incorporated into the cards. So with the Fool is given the 0, okay? And the next card being the 1. Now the 0 doesn't exist in Roman numerals, okay? But yet, and then he starts to use the Roman numeral. Now, also one of the things that 0 represents in our culture, in Western culture, has a lot to do with the calendar system. In fact, Anno Dominus, the connotation of AD and BC, and starting with the birth of Jesus at 0, that's also part of that representation. Now, that's changed a bit, especially if you're an academic. They use before Common Era and Common Era, but we'll continue to use the BC and AD for our purposes, right? So in some ways, this card can also represent the beginning point of the time of Jesus, right? And that brings us to this card and the look of this character, vastly different than the juggler that's shown from the older cards. In fact, he's much more like he's a Jesus-looking character. He's a Christ character. It's almost, and some people consider that magician as being sort of like a Gnostic Christ, but he's an initiate, he's a disciple, and dressed very similar to like what the Essenes would have worn, like with the white linen. But he's also wearing the robe, the color red, which represents blood, the sacrifice of the ancient world. Now in his belt, he's wearing a green belt. Now, if you look, you got to look closely, like you got to really get into that card and maybe even go online and look it up. And I think even A.E. White in his pictorial guide to the tarot even talks about this, how that is the serpent from the garden, from paradise, and represents the Gnostic teachings and the gnosis that comes from understanding, comes from moving towards knowledge, and sort of like the defeat of the serpent. When we talk about Gnosticism and gnosis means in ancient Greek, knowledge. Okay, so there's a difference between being a Gnostic, big G, and recognizing gnosis and being Gnostic in your approach. That's the small g, right? So that's a sign that he has conquered the dark forces, but also come to a sort of a Gnostic understanding. Okay, so that's kind of an interesting, that's a lot of the time is very lost to people. So here we go. We've got A. Waite kind of bringing up to speed sort of this ancient notion. Now, his interpretations of the cards don't just come from his own, okay? In fact, they do come from this whole lineage, like what I'm talking about. And so in some ways, like his understanding of those symbols, they do come from there, right? They were so hidden. You got to understand, we take for granted how much we're able to express and to talk about all of these things. Back in even his time, it was difficult, but back in the 1700s, back in the 1500s, it's very difficult. Everything had to be veiled. Everything had to be talked about in double, triple ways. You needed a cipher, everything had to be hidden. You ran the risk of being deemed a heretic and burnt at the stake. Okay, so let's go and look at the 4 objects. So let's take a look here. We've got the 4 objects, the 4 elements, okay, which also represent the 4 cardinal signs of the zodiac. So that's kind of an important thing, and it helps draw out more of this ancient system. Okay, so let's start with the wands. Now the wands, quite simply, like the wand, the magical wand, this goes back in biblical times. Now, if you remember the 10 Commandments, the movie, but in the story of, it's just quite simply like when Moses and Aaron are confronting the Pharaoh, the staff that Aaron uses turns into a snake and devours the other snake-turned staves of the Egyptian Magi, right? That's part of that story. This is that magical wand, okay? This is part of where we get it from. This was also one of the objects supposedly put into the Ark of the Covenant, and this represents that the budding wand of Aaron. Okay, but it's this idea also from the Arthurian legends and some of the legends around the Old Testament on when Adam and Eve experienced the fall and were expulsed from paradise. Eve took a branch with her, and part of that branch was planted and created all trees, but was continually blooming, continually blossoming. When they ate the fruit from the tree of knowledge, and they became ashamed, and they covered themselves when God came and found them, and that's one of the legends, that she covered herself with this twig, and that's what she left Eden with. Okay, and that's just one of the stories. Okay, that's just another part of it. But then it's this idea that the magician uses a wand in 1195 I think it was 1195, but shortly before the Crusades were called, and Pope Urban II was doing a council, and an envoy from the Eastern Roman Empire, from the Byzantine Empire, came on behalf of Emperor Alexis Comnenus, brought him a gift of a piece of the true cross in an attempt to get the Western world and the Franks on the side of the Eastern Romans to help retake parts of that were lost to Seljuk Turks and the encroachment of the Muslim world onto the Eastern Roman Empire. And partly is what helped spark the Crusades. Now, when he went out and tried to convince people in the calling of the Crusades, he went out carrying a piece of this true cross, okay? And if you look into the legends of this was a momentous occasion in European history and European culture. Like a spell had been cast on the people in a manner of speaking. This is sort of what it's symbolizing. A big part of the influx of people after the First Crusade and the succession of crusades, right from the beginning of that crusade, people started to bring back objects, sacred relics, bones, pieces of the saints, all sorts of stuff, and I mean, most of it was made up because there was no way of validifying any of this. And this became a big trade. This became a thing, right? And so in some ways that's kind of what this represents. The other thing too is this staff that, and you'll see it with the hermit card, right? He's walking with this staff. That's also one of the poles that they used to secure and move the Ark of the Covenant. And so that's another part of that symbol. Okay, so moving on, we got the cup. There is this dove descending with a communion wafer into the cup. A dove is a symbol of the Holy Spirit. The cup represents the vessel, the heart, and the emotional body is like that vessel. Okay? From the mystical Christian sort of context of it, is that there is this story, an alternate story, how the teachings of Christ came to Europe, and this succession that is outside of the Catholic Church. Okay, and that's another part of it. And there's this legend and this story of how Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus had taken Jesus' body off of the cross, but had collected the blood and the water that came from his wound. Okay, and then and used the chalice from the Last Supper, and took that chalice and brought it into Europe and brought it to Glastonbury. Then there's another sort of legend how Mary Magdalene came 11 years after Jesus had left. And she came to Europe, came to Marseille, and spent 30 years in a cave after she had shown the people, I guess. The church didn't necessarily agree with that. There's not much known about Mary Magdalene. There's very, very little written about her. And so in some ways that's also a part of that. Now, if you look at this card, the M, this has kind of fooled people for a long time. They have not really understood. Now, this is something that A.E. Waite has put on here. This isn't coming from the older cards, right? This is a symbol that he's put on there. Now, the M can quite literally represent Mary. Okay, like that's very obvious. The mother of Jesus being the vessel of God. Okay. The other part of it is this the mother and the womb. Okay. And just the spiritual significance of that, and how profound like birthing a baby is. And like that even happens within the human form is so amazing. But it in part is the spiritual womb. Now, it's interesting, the choice of using the W is very specific. In fact, if you look at the night sky in the northern hemisphere, especially right now, if you look out to the north, you will see a big W in the sky. It's very obvious. It's the constellation Cassiopeia. Okay. Now, Cassiopeia is one of those constellations that especially if you're high up enough, but usually throughout most of the year, you can see it. It moves around the polar region and will go from being a W to an M back to a W again. That's one of the symbols. In Christian astrology, if you can even say that there was such a thing, but there is remnants of this. And more importantly, like the astronomical map, because basically that's what some of the monks and the scholars did in the 12th century and stuff, were to take old teachings and sort of Christianize them. And they would take the celestial map and give them names of the saints and different apostles. Constellation Cassiopeia is also represented by Mary Magdalene. Now, it's an interesting thing, this whole story, kind of like what I was saying about the wand and everything else. Mariolatry, this worship of Mary, didn't just come out of nowhere. This has sort of been a very long-standing thing. But out of that Middle Ages period, there became almost this obsession, and it was people started to honor Mary Magdalene a lot. In fact, so much so the church had to step in and they had to replace it with Mary. And that's, in a lot of ways, that's why you see so many churches in Europe, like all of the cathedrals, are consecrated to Mary. And part of that hidden story is to cover up this succession, this alternate succession of the church. Now, who was the first person to see Jesus after his resurrection? It was Mary. Some people believe that Jesus and Mary actually had children. I'm not sure if I believe that anymore. I don't know if that was ever a thing that might be part of the ruse. I'm not sure. It's more about the symbol of the sacred union. But it's this thing of going back into the ancient system, how ancient religion was so tied to the stellar motions, and all of the seasons were tied also to the prominent areas of the chart, but were tracked by the stars and the planets, right? All of the holidays, all the church holidays, in some way plug into this ancient system. They basically took it over. When Christianity became the accepted religion in the Roman Empire, at the end of the Roman Empire, and upwards, go onward, the whole idea was the early Christians and the early Catholic Church would go to these pagan sites and these old sites and replace them and build churches on top of them. And the same kind of thing has happened with these understandings. That's part of it, right? The other thing too is the lotus that sits behind or below is also this representation of the goddess going back into ancient Egypt, ancient India, ancient Sumeria. The lotus flower was a very prominent symbol, a symbol of rebirth and regeneration. And so if we look at the cards, we go back to the magician here and around the table and everything, we have the rose and the lily, okay? And that, in some ways, this continuation of the symbol is continued through the rose and the lily. In some ways, the rose and the lily can be considered like the god and the goddess. Jesus and Mary. So moving on here. So we got the sword. The sword is kind of interesting. The pen is mightier than the sword. That's what the artist, the actor, the juggler, the magician is there to present, okay? Even though he has a sword. Now, part of that sword is not only there to defend himself, but it's also a symbol in the magical operation, let's say. And on one level, it's there to cut away negative ego and to cut away that which no longer serves us energetically and spiritually. Now, the sword represents the thought and the communication, and it also represents the legends. And so I even talked a little bit about this, but the stories that have come, right? And how they've been sort of molded to fit the time, okay? And so we've got the crown, which is the king, right? And so in many ways, those stories have sort of rested within the realm of kinghood and the aristocracy. And we didn't see a freeing of this until much, much later, way after Jesus' time, okay? But that's a big part of it. That is the sort of the understanding there. So we've got the laurel and a holly wreath, which were signs of victory. The Celtic people, the Druidic people, which is kind of what this holly represents, were defeated in the same light as how the Romans were defeated. Okay? They were taken over and their stories and everything were assimilated and brought into what we see in the Christian world. Okay, and that, in one way, that's kind of what this sort of represents now. In the Old Testament, After David defeats the Nephilim Goliath, the giant Goliath, he claims his sword as a trophy. So in some ways that represents his sword. The other part of it is the sword that hit the head of John the Baptist. And this is another one of those legends which goes back to Excalibur and the sword that was given to Arthur from the Lady of the Lake. Why is John the Baptist's head so important? Because he was the one that initiated Jesus. He is the one that started the process for Jesus. Some people claim that John was an Essenes. Now the Essenes were very old, like hundreds of years before Jesus' time, but they were very against the Orthodox, like the mainstream part of Judaic culture, the Sadducees and the Pharisees. Okay, and the Essenes kind of taught a little bit of a different process. And in fact, if you look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, you can see where Jesus and his community got some of these ideas. It's a direct continuation. Now, the Essenes didn't follow per se a lunar calendar like the Jewish people did. They followed a solar calendar. And so in the last one here, we've got the pentacle, the coin, which represents the earth. Okay, and the coin, quite simply, this is the coin that the master builder requires in order to build. Okay, now if you look at the 5-pointed star, if you remember when I was talking about the Fool, that 5-pointed star can represent Venus, because Venus every 8 years will draw out a 5-pointed star exactly at the helical rising at the sunrise. Okay, that's one thing, but it also can represent the 5 naked eye planets: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, enabling us to sort of recognize what are the different types of energies, and when do we enact certain festivals and ceremonies. Okay, this kind of leads us back to that kind of Essean notion, or that alternate viewpoint. The pagan world was also one part where we get astrology from. We also get astrology from the Arabic world also, but in many ways, like, one of the hidden parts of the pagan religion and the Roman religion and things like that were based on the astrology, based on the motion of the sun and the moon and the planets. If you see here, we've got the lily and the roses, same as in the symbol here, right? And it's sort of leading us. The path is kind of leading us to sort of this notion or this understanding, right? It's a deeper understanding. Okay, now that we've finished that, now let's move on and let's do a little reading, and let's continue on with the building of our spread. And so today what we're going to do is a little read with 5 cards. And we're going to use, like what I was saying about the 5 naked eye planets, as placement of the cards and meanings of the cards. Okay, and this is going to be like very simple. It's like guidance for us, and it's part of our learning. Okay, so remember, each card is going to be placed in relation to the planets: Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. Now, one thing that the tarot also helped in bringing us, and also as part of like modern spirituality, is kind of deviating from dualistic thinking, especially with astrology. One way to sort of navigate that is, if you're going to look at one aspect of the card, you have to look at its opposite in order to sort of understand, or the planet, right? Or the star sign, or whatever it is, right? So especially with the planets, and looking at the planets from a negative light, I mean, because like the malefic planets are, from the ancient system, would be Saturn and Mars, and Mercury can be neutral. Okay, that's not necessarily the best way to look at it, because more from a modern standpoint, from a psychological standpoint, we can gather a lot more from it by incorporating both and sort of taking a look. Whereas, like, quite simply, like Mercury represents our thoughts and our mind. Venus represents like our values in some ways. And not only like our appreciation for art and beauty, it's the sign of love, but it has a lot to do with our value system. Mars is that sort of fire, is that fiery energy. It's that motivating energy. It's like another part of like, what do we need to act on? Knowing when is the right time to act and when is the right time to wait, okay? Mars isn't just about war. Jupiter represents expansion and like the higher mind in a lot of ways. It can be very frivolous also, whereas Saturn represents like focus and contraction. Is also another aspect of mind, of the higher mind, yet this card more brings everything to sort of like an earthly kind of perspective, but it also kind of shows us what direction we need to aim for and where we need to focus our energies, okay? Okay, so in the Mercury place, we've got Knight of Wands. Knight of Wands, that's like going outside. Going outside of ourselves. When you feel the inspiration, like move with it, like that fire. If people are wanting to reach out to other people, this is such a good time to do it. This is such a perfect opportunity to do so, right? But it's also striking ahead with like new ideas, innovative ideas, anything that might be. This can also represent younger people, young adults, teenagers, and that kind of energy in our lives, right? So we've got 5 of coins, the 5 of pentacles reversed in the placement of Venus. And so where should our values be? Our values should, like, where should we be? Like, what should we value more? What is without or what is within? What is within? But it's like a rearranging of like our perspective in regards to like our desire in the world. Shifted inward. The fear of money shifted inward. The fear of what's going on with the material world shifted inward, right? Address first the core issue within yourself. Reestablish a new sort of perspective first from that point. Know your value, right? Your value comes from within you, not outside, okay? Mars, so funny, the 2 of Swords in the position of Mars, the card of peace in Mars, in the Mars position. So it's like actively seeking peace, actively seeking resolution, actively stilling any kind of conflict that might be in your life. Like in action, meditating. And I guess many of us might be put into positions where we do have to be diplomatic and stuff. There's no other way to follow the intuition if we don't first still the mind and sit this notion. Jupiter. Okay, yeah, Jupiter, that I love the King of Pentacles. King of Pentacles is a great card. That's usually very positive. This is like the wise grandpa. This is the wise guy, the truth teller, and the provider. That's the thing, like anybody that's got kind of ideas, like business ideas or anything like that, this is the time to really start it. And it might be difficult to get it going, but this is the time to start. Whenever things are challenging, that's the best time for business. It's more too in the sense of it's time to sort of, for us to access that inner wisdom within us and to sort of allow it to kind of go out into the world where it needs to. In seeing that if we're constantly holding ourselves, which is not what Jupiter is. Jupiter is about expansion. It will never be shared. Right? So if we get into this free flow and you accept that part of self that's been developed, then it can come out in a very clear way. Okay. And then the last one, we got Saturn, and we've got the 2 of Cups in Saturn, which is so interesting. Focused on love. Interesting though, that's not always 2 lovers coming together. That's 2 opposites that come together to make a unity. And that's the thing, it could be time for people to meet their love. This is a time, but it's more about sort of achieving a better focus in life. Okay. So finding those elements in your world that might be opposite, but they need to come in order for you to feel a completion, a wholeness, in order to sort of move forward. So it's like seeking out those things that might be opposite of us, but to create a greater sense of wholeness so that we can achieve more of a focus, so that we can continue on the path that's been established. Okay, that was a lot. I hope everybody got something from it. Got to do some research, got to look up some of the names and some of the things that I mentioned to sort of fill in some of the blanks. And if you haven't already, hit the subscribe button and leave a like. That helps a ton. And wherever you are, please, please, please take good care, and hope to see you on the next one. Bye-bye.